Hi everyone, this is part 1 of the lecture to accompany Chapter 7 in your textbook. Please carefully read Chapter 7 as there are ideas and examples that I don't have time to address in this lecture. Okay, let's get started on analyzing arguments. Up to this point, we've looked at arguments, what they are, how they're constructed, what the difference between a good and poor argument is, and how to spot fallacies in them. Now we're going to learn how to analyze arguments by taking them apart to see exactly how they're put together. Now, why would you need to do this? Because to be a good critical thinker, you need to be able to see how an argument is constructed, to be able to determine if it's trustworthy or if it's not. As this Stanford University quote says, "It is only through this critical evaluation that students can distinguish among competing claims for truth and determine which arguments and points of view they can trust and those of which they should be skeptical." We're going to look at 2 types of argument analysis, diagramming and standardization. Part 1 of this lecture will focus on diagramming, which is used when analyzing shorter arguments and involves labeling the different parts of the argument and arranging them in diagram form to see how the parts interconnect. In Part 2 of the lecture, we will discuss standardization, which is used in longer arguments like opinion pieces or editorial articles in magazines, thesis papers, and the like. In it, you will restate, paraphrase, and summarize the arguments in concise and clear manner and arrange them so that the pattern of the argument is obvious. Okay, so let's go through the rules of diagramming an argument. Then we're going to look at a few arguments and diagram them so you can see how it works. When looking at any argument, the first step is to carefully read through it. You want to identify the conclusion. That way you'll know what you're working towards. We talked about ways to identify conclusions in earlier chapters. Then number the statements consecutively as they appear in the arguments. Remember, some things are not statements, so leave those out of the numbering process. And then after that, you arrange the numbers on the page with the premises above the conclusion they support. And then using arrows and plus signs as necessary, your diagram should end up looking like a flow chart that shows the way in which the premises support the conclusion. Let's look at an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, here's an argument. The death penalty should be abolished because it is racially discriminatory, it is not a deterrent to crime, and innocent people are sometimes executed by mistake. So the first thing we need to do is distinguish the conclusion from the premises. Since the word because is a typical premise indicator, it looks fairly obvious that anything after it's going to be a premise. In fact, there are several premises. It is racially discriminatory, it is not a deterrent to crime, innocent people are sometimes executed by mistake. Those are the premises. And because of that, it's also pretty easy to spot the conclusion, which is the first statement here. The death penalty should be abolished. Okay, now we need to number the statements. Even though this is just a single sentence, it's a complete argument with 4 statements in it. The number 1 statement is the death penalty should be abolished. Number 2, it is racially discriminatory. Number 3, it is not a deterrent to crime. Number 4, innocent people are sometimes executed by mistake. Then we need to write the numbers down. Remember that the conclusion goes at the bottom, even though in this case the conclusion is the first thing in the argument. So number 1 goes at the bottom and 2, 3, and 4 go above it. Since all of them support the conclusion, all of them should have arrows leading to the conclusion. The argument diagram for this argument looks like the one at the bottom of this page. That's a fairly simple argument. Let's move on to something a little bit more complicated. In the last argument, all of the premises directly supported the conclusion. In this argument, however, the premises need each other to come to the conclusion, so let's take it step by step. Most Democrats are liberals. Amy is a Democrat. Therefore, Amy is probably a liberal. Because we have the conclusion indicator, therefore, we can see that Amy is probably a liberal is the conclusion. So the other statements, most Democrats are liberals and Amy is a Democrat, those are the premises. Then we number them in the order in which they appear, which makes the conclusion 3. So we put 3 at the bottom and 1 and 2 above it. However, unlike the last argument where each of the premises directly supports the conclusion because each of them gave a good reason to support the conclusion, this is different. Most Democrats or liberals does not directly lead to the conclusion that Amy is a liberal. Neither does the statement, Amy is a Democrat, lead to the conclusion that Amy is a liberal. Those two statements have to be together in order to adequately lead to the conclusion. So you would need to put a plus sign between them to signify that together they lead to the conclusion. Then you put an arrow leading from the two premises together down to the conclusion. So what those last two examples showed you was the difference between independent support and linked support. In independent support, each premise by itself is a good reason to support the conclusion. In linked support, the premises must be used together to support the conclusion. How do you tell? Well, if you take away one of them, do you still have enough information to support the conclusion? If not, then it's linked support. Let's go over these two different kinds of support again so you understand them. So for independent support, here's the example. 10 witnesses say that Blotto robbed the bank. Blotto's fingerprints were found on the note the robber handed to the teller. Therefore, it's very likely that Blotto robbed the bank. Therefore, it's a conclusion indicator. So it's very likely that Blotto robbed the bank is the conclusion. The other statements, 10 witnesses say that Blotto robbed the bank, and Blotto's fingerprints were found on the note the robber handed to the teller. Those are premises. So we number these statements 1, 2, and 3. Then we put 3 at the bottom because that's the conclusion, and 1 and 2 are above it. Now we need to see if this support is independent or linked. Look at the first reason. Is it a good reason to conclude it's very likely Blotto robbed the bank? Are 10 witnesses saying that Blotto robbed the bank good reason? Yes. So that is independent of the other thing. Is the second reason, Blotto's fingerprints on the note, a good reason? Yes, that is a good reason by itself that Blotto possibly robbed the bank. Now, of course, together they do make a pretty good case against Blotto, but each of them is at least a decent reason that leads to the conclusion, and each could stand alone as a reason. So each of them has an arrow that leads to the conclusion. For linked support, here's an example. Most golden retrievers are friendly. Sparky is a golden retriever, therefore Sparky is probably friendly. The word therefore indicates the conclusion. So the other statements are the premises. We number them, 1, 2, and 3, and put the conclusion, 3, under 1 and 2. Now we look at each premise independently. So statement 1 by itself. Most golden retrievers are friendly. Does that lead necessarily to the conclusion that Sparky is probably friendly? Not by itself, because without the other premise, we wouldn't know that Sparky is a golden retriever. So we need 1 and 2 together to come to 3, which is the conclusion. So we put a plus sign between 1 and 2, then the arrow down for both of them to 3. Here's something that's a bit different from the ones we just looked at, but we need to know this because we're going to be combining these different types together shortly. Sometimes, in an argument, there's more than one conclusion. Here's an example. Jim is a senior citizen, so Jim probably doesn't like hip-hop music, so he probably won't be going to the Jay-Z concert this weekend. In this argument, there are 2 so's. Those are conclusion indicators, and 3 statements. So if we label them 1, 2, and 3, we can then look at this argument and notice that the first statement is offered as evidence for the second statement. Jim is a senior citizen, so he probably doesn't like hip-hop music. So 1 supports 2. And then 2 supports 3. Statement 2 is both a conclusion and evidence for the next conclusion. So the diagram looks like it does at the bottom. 1 leads to 2, which leads to 3. So now we're going to put these things together into an argument that's a bit more complicated. Here's the example. Most Democrats are liberals, and Senator Dumdiddle is a Democrat. Thus, Senator Dumdiddle is probably a liberal. So, he probably supports affirmative action in higher education because most liberals support affirmative action in higher education. First, we need to look for the conclusion. In this case, we actually have 2 conclusions because we have 2 conclusion indicators, thus and so. We also have 1 premise indicator, which is because. Now let's break this down into statements. There are 5 statements. And once we look at that, you can see that actually statement 1 and statement 2 lead to statement 3. So statements 1 and 2 are premises leading to the conclusion, which is statement 3. So let's first take that. So look at the diagram below. So if I put 3 down first and I put 1 and 2 above it, then I need to look at 1 and 2 and see if they are independent or linked. So most Democrats are liberals, thus Senator Dumdiddle is probably a liberal. No, I need the second premise, Senator Dumdiddle is a Democrat, to lead to that. So 1 and 2 are linked. So I put the plus statement between 1 and 2, and then both of those lead to 3. So that's the first part of this argument. Now, 3 is also evidence for the next conclusion, which is number 4. He probably supports affirmative action in higher education, so I need to put that underneath it. But it's not independent. I need number 5. I need to know that most liberals support affirmative action in higher education to come to that conclusion, which is number 4. So I put 5 on the same level with 3, link them with a plus sign, and then the arrow goes down to 4. So I hope that you can see how this diagram explains what's happening in this argument. Okay, you'll be doing some diagramming exercises on your own, and we're going to work together on some in class as well. But let's go over the basic tips for diagramming. Always look for the conclusion first. You can do that by finding premise and conclusion indicators, or by trying to figure out what the main idea is, or by looking at the first and last statements in the paragraph, any number of ways to get to what exactly the conclusion is. Remember, you're looking at statements, not necessarily sentences, because sentences can express more than one statement. If you see the word "and" in a sentence, that's a hint that there's probably more than one statement in it. Also, if you see things that are not statements, like questions that are not rhetorical, commands, or exclamations, ignore those. They're not part of the argument. If you see conditional statements or disjunctive statements like these, if I win the lottery, I will move to Tahiti. Either Boston will win or Cleveland will win. Don't break those up. They express one thought. Don't number or diagram non-statements or irrelevant statements. If it has nothing to do with the argument, leave it out. Also, if an argument says the same thing twice, leave out one of the statements and represent it in the diagram just one time. This is the end of part 1 of chapter 7. Please move on to part 2.